of the things that amaze me, I've got these, the things that Guinness sent to Courage when they were going to start brewing Harp Lager was really detailed instructions.
Yeah.
And what they were saying is that at the end of it, you'd put it in the tanks, you'd spun it.
Yeah.
So you'd seal it up and it would naturally carbonate.
Absolutely.
And so the original Harp Lager was naturally carbonated.
Yeah.
I was completely gobsmacked when I learned it. But then again, you look at it, they got in a German brewer to do this. I mean, obviously, they stopped doing all this stuff after a while.
They did, because it's quite hard to control. And then they had to push it through their filters and pasteurizers. So they had to boost it again anyway. By the time they'd mucked around with it,
it probably tasted really nice straight off the tank.
It would have done, and that's what I was talking about in our last talk. You know, when I tasted
when you were saying about the Truman's beers. So I mean, what was that like as a brewer? Was that really depressing when the beer was?
I mean, it's yes and no. I mean, I think that's what convinced me initially that cask beer was a better offering. But I did like the bottle condition beers. I mean, they weren't bad. I mean, I wouldn't call them bad beers. And if the brewery was reasonably good about transferring, not picking up too much DO, as I said, we weren't in a position to be able to measure it in those days. And probably, I mean, I think the full on tradition of how you bring beers into conditioning, but a lot of breweries had redox rooms without really understanding what they were about. But it was about undergoing a secondary fermentation prior to moving on. And so that you built up condition and that you also removed any oxygen. And I think that had sort of gone out really during this sort of rush to put filtered beer into bottles and cans and kegs.
Because I mean, what I'm thinking of is Newark, the brewery, the one I worked in very briefly, was they didn't do any cask beer, but their beer was all bright.
Yeah.
So if you had bright beer through electric pumps and someone who was just serving the beer too fresh from cask through electric pumps, it tasted almost exactly the same. Because this was beer which hadn't been pasteurized.
No, that's right.
It hadn't been heavily carbonated, and it was served through electric pumps. So it was sort of like it was way better than keg beer. And it was better than bad cask beer. But it was nowhere near as good cask beer, and so I could see why.
Was that from cellar tanks?
No, this was from kegs. So this was
from kegs.
Yeah. This all went into 50 and 100 liter.
Which brewery was it?
This was the former Holds Brewery in Newark. So it was Courage.
Was that under the Whitbread?
No, it was Courage.
Oh, it was Courage. I know quite a few of the regional breweries were putting them through, effectively through sterile filters.
Yeah, well, I mean, Whitbread, all the Whitbread stuff in the north, apart from Castle Eden, all their beer was bright.
Yeah, that was all bright and sterile filtered.
Yeah, and it's, but you see, it's like a big difference from the keg beers. I mean, you were on about how heavily they were pasteurized. And that was the thing. This is the reason why, with bright beer, I'd been in Tetley's pubs where I couldn't tell whether they got bright beer or cask beer. And there was one in particular where I noticed when the landlord went on holiday and they got a relief landlord in who looked after the beer better. Then I realized, oh, yes, it was really cask. But they were serving it through electric pumps, so you couldn't really see.
No.
And this was really typical in the north. But I think in the south it all went to actual full-blown keg, didn't it?
Yeah, pretty much. And most people,
you do tank beer?
Whitbread was still sterile filtering. So things like Trophy was sterile filtered. No, Courage were for some of their beers. I think when I started at Truman's, they'd started putting in pasteurized, and certainly all the bottles were tunnel pasteurized, bottles
Okay.
and cans.
But did Truman's use electric pumps at all, or was it always top
No.
pressure pumps?
They had a few, but mainly it was hand pulls in the south.
Okay, so it was either hand pulled or full on keg.
Yeah, they didn't go for top pressure. Whitbread started putting top pressure on casks, which is positive to some extent. You can't use them, of course, with hand pulls because it would push through. So, but you can use them with the beer dispense pumps. So you could use it with the beer dispense pumps.
So I didn't that's something new for me. So this is Whitbread from Chiswell Street.
Yeah, whether it was Chiswell Street or mainly their breweries in the north. I remember going to where they were definitely using. I mean, I think in the south they mainly stuck with hand pulls. So I think the cask beer was their kegs were sterile filtered. I seem to remember, but not when they changed. I think when they went to Luton, I think they put in pasteurizers. Yeah, quite a few breweries were playing with top pressure, which it was quite good. And then they just had a little font with it looked like a keg, but it was coming from a top pressured cask. But of course, that was another satanic act as far as CAMRA concerned. So.
Yeah,
That sort of, unfortunately, it sort of rather killed off what was actually quite good beer. The beer was natural, and it would have carbonated up a degree naturally. And if you didn't have too much top pressure, it wouldn't have carbonated up as hugely. So.
yeah. I mean, there've been quite a few debates in Canberra that sort of sounded like medieval theological debates in a way.
Yeah.
These very fine points of doctrine, which
And
which
yeah, I mean, they did reluctantly agree to cask breathers as a potential way forward to help preserve cask beer in slow, accounts where you don't get much turnover, and if you don't have a cask breather, the place will stop doing cask beer altogether. And cask breathers are okay. It's not a top pressure because it's a demand valve. So you almost have to generate a vacuum in the cask to suck in the CO2.
So I mean, so I would imagine it's not actually making any more CO2 dissolve in the beer, is it?
No. And CO2 will exchange anyway from the stuff in there and that, but it'll reach a balance fairly quickly. But the balance would be quite low. I mean, cask breathers, in my view, they won't hold a beer in what I like good condition for a cask beer. For example, a good cask beer will have in terms of volume, round about 1.3, 1.4 volume CO2. So for every pint of beer, there's a pint and a third of gas dissolved in it. Keg beer will be double that. Keg and bottled beer will be double that. So, but cask beer, good cask beer will be about that. If you use a cask breather, just because of the laws of physics, it'll come down to about 1. If you open vent it, it can go lower than 1 at 0.8, 0.7, in which case it just tastes flat. And invariably, because of the oxygen, it starts to spoil because of the oxygen ingress, and you'll get aldehydic staling flavors. So, cask breathers are okay. They're good in my view.
Okay.
But I don't mind top pressure. I like the flavor of the beer, and I don't want it flat, and I don't want it infected, and I don't want it oxidized.
Yeah, I quite like my beer fairly flat, but so to ask you something about primings.
Yes.
Primings. I see primings come up in brewing records a lot.
Absolutely.
And I was thinking, okay, I would have thought, okay, when it's a cask beer, you can understand they're going to prime it. because they've
Yes.
fermented. It's been fermented down. You want to have something for the yeast to work on in the casks. You prime it.
Yeah.
Makes sense. It's the way, like as a home brewer, where you put sugar into the bottle to carbonate the beer naturally.
Yes.
But then I see stuff that's going into tank to be bottled that's being primed as well.
Yes.
And what's the function there?
Well, that's to give it palate fullness and a degree of sweetness.
Okay, so that's not going to be doing any fermenting in the tank, is it, before bottling?
No.
Okay. So
Not if it's filtered. It would do if it was a bottle conditioned beer, obviously in the same way that home brewers bring their beer into condition that way.
Okay, but it depends. If you just rack it straight from the tank, straight from the fermenter into a tank, where it's still going to have yeast into it, and then you process it after that.
Yeah, it depends how long you take to process it.
But
and what temperature the tank is, Ron, and what yeast it is. So
okay.
And to some extent, what primings you use. We talked about Truman's in our last meeting. We did a keg beer known as Ben Truman Export Draft, which became quite a sort of replacement brand in lots of the estate because we were part of Watney Man Truman Brewers. Watney's Red Barrel was getting a bit of a pasting from CAMRA, and in many accounts they will put in Ben Truman Export Draft in. But it was quite full. It was designed by our wonderful research and development team, and they use a non-fermentable primings made of a milk sugar, so laevuline primings. So a bit like adding lactose to milk stout.
But laevuline, I thought laevuline was fructose.
No, laevuline is unfermentable. It might be part fructose, but I think it's unfermentable.
Okay, good, because the whole sugars thing is it's like a complete different world.
Right hand.
Yeah, but laevuline. What I have,
I think from memory, I'd have to look it up, and I can't remember who used to supply it now. It was one of the major sugars.
But sugars are a complete nightmare for me
when
I'm trying to write recipes.
Yeah, I've always thought, and I might be wrong on this, but the beer was pasteurized anyway, so it wasn't going to ferment. And the only time we added the primings, effectively to a beer going straight into filtration. It was all added on run. So it was never going to ferment, even if it was fermentable. I've got a feeling, though, it was unfermentable, or mainly unfermentable.
Yeah.
By normal
yeast. But that's a. I'm glad you
that's
said
it. That's the thing you have to add with all of these beers, by normal yeast,
because I know that there are types of Brettanomyces which can ferment lactose.
Oh yeah, they will.
Yeah, well,
I will ferment anything given half a chance. If they won't, something else in the mix will.
Well, the weird thing about Brettanomyces is that quite often the one thing they can't ferment is maltose.
Yeah.
Which is fairly ironic. But I wanted to ask some questions.
Yeah.
About Truman's, and they had maltings still, didn't they, in the 70s?
They did. Yeah, they had maltings at Long Melford in Suffolk.
In Suffolk.
Yeah, Long Melford.
Because I mean, I'll see in the brewing records it'll say a malt, and it'll say in brackets own make.
Yeah.
And then that's from their own maltings.
Yeah, I mean, most of the major breweries had their own maltings.
Yeah, someone showed I just on Twitter today, someone who posted going past the Bass maltings.
Yeah.
In Sleaford this year.
Yeah,
it's absolutely enormous.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, Bass had lots of them. I
was gobsmacked because I can remember what the maltings in Newark used to look like.
Yeah.
There were some big maltings in Newark. And
this was Newark is famous for it, yeah.
Yeah, but this was like 4 times the size of any of the ones in Newark.
And until recently they were running Coors. I think they've sold it off now, but they were still running the Tower maltings, one of the first Tower maltings in the middle of Burton. I mean, that was Bass.
Oh, right.
All Allied had all brew maltings as a whole company with about 4 different, one of which was in Newark, I'm sure. But Missley, up and down the country, quite a few up north.
Yeah, this is always the thing when I'm looking in brewing records, and I see the names of the Newark maltsters.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's always,
yeah.
So Gilstrap, which is one of the big ones. Earp.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird, and they've got all these things named after these people. So in Newark, the library in the town centre was the Gilstrap Library, named after one of the maltsters. The school I went to was on Earp Avenue, named after one of the other maltsters.
They were quite sort of patrician and quite generous to the communities, I think, in all these areas.
Well, yeah, well, they were
brewing and malting in general.
Yeah, well, I mean, they were obviously big employers in the town, and brought in a lot of money. But the Truman's ones, when did they close?
I was certainly quite a bit on. What happened was, because we became Watney Man, and then there was Watney Man Truman Maltings, and of course we had Watney's. I mean, I don't know all of them because they had quite a few up north with all the different breweries that were based in the north. But they certainly had maltings at Bures. They had the maltings at Tivershall, and Tivershall was the one that they rebuilt and spent a lot of money on.
And where was that exactly?
Tivershall, it's in Suffolk.
Okay.
Not far from Ipswich. They had some in Ipswich as well, or Norwich. I think they had Norwich maltings as well as the brewery. But they had a lot. So Long Melford closed, I think, probably mid to late 70s. Not quite sure about that. And the production was put into the other Watney maltings, particularly with and the head maltster of Watney Man Truman Maltings was a chap called Paul Northern, and he was quite go ahead, and he put in the Tivershall maltings was based on a relatively new idea of continuous malting. So you didn't do it in the stages; it was meant to be continuous. But we often thought that the malt was still germinating on its way down to us in the vehicles by the stage. But yeah,
so I mean,
it wasn't its best.
So I mean, was this just base pale malt that was coming out of the Truman maltings?
Yeah, although they had a roasting plant in one of them, and I can't remember which one. So they had their own roasting plant, but that burnt down as most roasting plants do. And then they went to that maltings was sold off and still run. And Simpsons have rebuilt it, and Simpsons have just got they've got a coloured plant in there. So Simpsons now run that plant. I did hear the story that Fuller's had the maltings, a bit like Mortlake. I mean, of course, the Mortlake maltings is still quite a famous building because it's right there at the finish of the boat race. You see it every year on TV. But opposite there was a maltings that Fuller's had, and that apparently that was bombed. So during the war, and Fuller's had to start. They spoke with John Crisp, and he helped them out during the war, apparently. So
yeah, okay.
Fuller's always used to have a good relationship with Crisp.
Yeah, well, I see they've been taken over, haven't they?
Yeah, they have. Yeah, bit of a shame.
Yeah, that's the only maltsters I've ever been round. It's Crisp.
Yeah, lovely people. I mean, absolutely.
Yeah, no, I mean, really interesting because they got the floor malting there still and everything.
Yeah, they've got the floor malting still. Well, they've got the whole works there now, and they've just put a new coloured plant in with a different sort of system, a tower roaster as opposed to a drum roasting.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
So hops.
Yes, we have our own hop farms.
That's what I thought as well. Yes, in Kent, I guess.
Yeah. They were down. Oh, blimey, where were they? Oh, the hop farm. Oh, it'll come to me in a minute, Ron. I'll have to look it up.
But what varieties were they growing there?
They were brewing Fuggles and Goldings, but one of the big ones that we were getting from that, well, they were doing Progress, so we used to get THB Progress. One called OT 48,
That's a snappy name.
I think he's now Bramling Cross.
Okay.
OT 48 was the name of when they do the trials, the hop selection trials. They have hills it's a bit like a patchwork and the different hops, and they can recall which ones are where, and it's a bit like a crossword. So it's reading a map. It's a grid reference on the trial hop field for which one is which one. So it was OT 48, and I'm pretty sure it became Bramling Cross, which is that one with the slightly blackcurranty.
Because I've seen this before, and some of the World War II Youngers logs, they've got something that's similar to that, two letters and two numbers.
Yeah.
I think, what was that?
Yeah.
Did that become that became a variety later on?
It's a sort of a coordinate reference for
but it was still
a field.
Yeah, so is it still an experimental variety at the time?
Yeah, it was experimental.
I think this was Brewer's Gold. That's what it was.
Yeah.
So it's like it was something very similar to what you just said.
It's the same thing, and then eventually it has a name. It starts off, and some people just call it the same plant because it's the same variety. But that's.
Because that's it. So I mean, when did they go away then?
Again, that went all because Watney's had hop farms. I don't know where they were though. They're around that area somewhere. Courage had a big one near the Truman one. Blimey, I should know. I went down there. It was sold off to the guy that used to be the hop farm manager. It was Robert Chater was the hop farm manager. God, it wasn't far from Paddock Wood, and I'm just trying to think of the exact location. It will come back to me. I'll look it up if it doesn't come back to me. But, we had our own hop farm, and of course we had arrangements with other hop growers. And we had our own maltings, and again arrangements with some of the sales maltsters.
So were you using all English hops?
Pretty much, yeah. Until we started brewing the lager, and then we started bringing in. Oh no, there was a during that time there was one of the British brewers, and I think it started with Allied, had quite a lot of success using Styrian Goldings. I mean, we would get some in from British Columbia as well. I remember the BC hops as well. They were still bringing hops in from America, but we always thought they were known in the trade as being a bit crude, a bit rough. In fact, they used to. Peter Kirby, who was the second brewer, and he used to rub them and say, "Cat's piss." So they used to go in the kettle and be boiled to buggery.
This is exactly what 19th century brewers were saying about American hops.
Yeah. Well, I don't think they ever got cat's piss on it. To be fair, I would smell it. It just feels it smells like nettles to me, or grapefruit sometimes. Yeah. But compared to the lovely smell you get off fresh Goldings in the field. But of course, our hop store, when I first moved in, was stuck up in the loft, completely uncooled and just in bags. I mean, it wasn't bad as you think, because but it wasn't chilled.
But I'm assuming that there was a cold store somewhere for hops, because
most of them came up from Paddock Wood, and they had some cold stores in the borough as well at one time.
Because I mean, it's one of the things that at first I didn't realise what it meant when it next to the hops it said CS, and then I realised, oh yeah, now I know it's cold stored. So these are things that have been in a cold store.
What would happen is that you bring up at the harvest time, you bring up the ones that for later in the year, you try and get into the cold store. I mean, you'd leave them on farm for quite a time. because it's then winter, and then next year it's starting to take them out. But some of the slower moving varieties would sit around in a rather warm loft in the brewery for quite some time. We did put in a cold store with the new brewery. I mean, the things did move on in the 70s, although there were some things that moved on and some things that went backwards, in my view. But
yeah. But like with mashing, did that change the way you mash between the old and the new brewery?
Oh, totally. Yeah. We went from traditional infusion mashing, as I mentioned before, with 6 large mash tuns, 2 small mash tuns. Although in my day we weren't using the small mash tuns at once, only when we did the occasional stout. So most of the coloured malts would go into in with the rest of the grist. But it was straight infusion mashing. There was no rake. The tun was dug out. And after an hour, you set taps and you run it for the next 6 to 8 hours.
So it was just a single infusion and then a
single infusion with mashing. Yeah.
And so then, so a sparge just with the taps open when you're sparging.
That's it. When you start running the tap. Well, we used to underlet, so we push a bit of water underneath, hot water underneath before we'd start, leave it another 10 minutes. Then you start running, but you start sparging at the same time. And then you're
so you underlet immediately.
You sparge until you've used up all the water you calculate you'll need. We still do the same at Wimbledon. It's a nice, easy way to brew.
So you just leave the bed undisturbed, apart from the underlet.
Yes. And the only time you had to do anything was if you dropped the bed, because we didn't have meters, so you were relying on the mash tun foreman or the stagehand to control the flow rate of the sparge and match it to the taps, and he would dip the bed to make sure it wasn't dropping too much or it didn't get wet. So it was down to the skill of them and how fast they run it. But the brewers would go in initially and set the taps, and we would sometimes go and play with them, but they would put them back where they wanted them afterwards. So yeah, it's the culture was very much one of them. It was I suppose it was based on a lot of things. Industry was based on the same sort of format you had in the army. You had the Hooray Henry officers, the sort of ship brewers, and then you had the real people that knew what was going on, the sergeants who were the foremen and the under foremen, and then the charge hands. It was all sort of, and your brewers, you had your junior shift brewers, your third brewer, your second brewer, your head brewer, and it was all quite regimented. We did away with it all in the 70s. Some of it was worth getting rid of. Others, no, it worked really well. and at the bottom of the pile were the ton scrubbers. I don't know if you've ever read a series of books by Mervyn Peake called Gorman Gas, Ron. It's the sort of semi-historical fantasy sort of thing. It's quite fascinating. Anyway, in this big house, this big family, this big castle, the sort of the lowest of the low were the grey stone scrubbers who used to scrub the kitchen surfaces and the floors, and then they would sleep in a pile underneath once they'd finished their day's work. Anyway, we had ton scrubbers who used to clean out the vessels. When you empty a vessel, which you did every day, they would get in there, don all their protective clothing, go in there with their buckets of caustic and all copper vessels with cooling coils inside. And
this is what, the fermenters?
Yeah, the fermenters.
So they were copper, the fermenters?
Yeah. It's copper and slate and some stainless steel, complete mixture.
And these were what, squares or rounds?
Squares and rounds.
Oh, God, you had everything.
Squares, oblongs. It was based on a dropping system. the original porter tons had gone. We still had the room, a bit like they had at Chiswell Street, but the porter tons had actually gone. This is in the old brewery that I started in.
So you drop it. So they were dropping the same way as at Fuller's.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You would drop by gravity. We called it cleansing. So you would ferment, you would collect on one day, and then 24 hours later, you would cleanse to the vessels, the long, shallow slate vessels often that were underneath.
Okay.
So they would drop. The London breweries like the dropping system. And then you would take the yeast off from the cleanse batches, but you'd leave the first krausen and the cold break behind in the original collecting vessel, fermenting vessel. Some beers we did all the way through in the fermenters.
No, the dropping systems. It's one of these things that I mean, I think that they were still doing it for Breaks beers, weren't they? And I think that was the only place left that were using this system.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, quite a lot of London. I don't know. I think they had the system in at Harvey's, but I don't think they used it. I mean, it was in at Young's, it was in at Fuller's, it was in most of the London traditional brews. I mean, originally they'd have put them into pontos.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say about pontos, because that's what you'd use for cleansing.
Yeah.
So they went
it's the same system, but I suppose when they replaced the smaller wooden vessels, because you can't make big, and they got copper lined, or as I say, a lot of them were made of slate. We had one area we didn't use it that much called the Old House, where all the squares were slate.
Okay, but I mean, I guess slate's a fairly good.
Oh, it's a lovely surface.
Yeah, because you can clean it nicely. It's
you could clean it and it comes up quite clean. I mean, you have the grouting, but no, I think they use quite good stuff. No, I think we got fairly good results there. One of the problems was that when you've got your vessels that you're going to take the yeast out, is you can have what is probably a more hygienic system, which is the chutes that they have at Schneider and the Griffin slide that you see on the settling square at Fuller's. That's one way. Or the other way was to have a parachute in the middle.
Yeah.
But of course, the parachute goes up and down. And you've got to have a nice gland, which is